let's remove the passenger side wheel. That'll give us access to everything behind it. So this one has a little locking nut, so take that out. And remove the wheel. Take off this shield here, two 10mm bolts. There we go. To start draining this radiator, here's the petcock. Usually there's a splash shield that runs from the subframe all the way to the front bumper. This one's missing. And if you have yours, there should be a hole here, so you can either reach from up top or from the side and unscrew this, and then it'll drain through that shield, but you'll have to take it off anyway so you can get to these lines and hoses. But basically, just go ahead and unscrew this and coolant will start coming out. Don't pull this plug out all the way. I made that mistake before and it comes shooting straight back. So just leave it like this. We'll let it drain for a few minutes. There's a 10mm bolt right here that locks in this overflow tank. I'm going to remove it so we can get this out of our way. Take that out, pull this up, and it's got a little pin that locks it in on the bottom. So there you go, a little rubber piece. Just move this up and out of your way. Let's take out this engine mount here. I'm going to start by removing this bolt here, 14mm socket. Okay, set that aside, and then there's one right here. Probably gonna have to do this one by hand. Take the bolt out, then remove this part of the engine mount. The reason I say this part is because now we have to take off this plate here. Three 14mm bolts hold this on. One over here. One over here. And one right there. This is a 12mm actually. Remove that. Okay, remember that this little plate mounted right here. Now you can pull this right up and out. Now this piece is just a spacer between the engine block and the mount here, so wiggle it. A lot of times it's just stuck on there with corrosion, so it should come free. There we go. Here it is. It's got a little dowel pin on the bottom. That usually gets a little rusty and gets stuck in there, but take this out. Let's disconnect these ground connectors while we're at it. Set those aside. It's nice that you don't have to unbolt them. There we go. At this point, I want to remove this timing cover here. It's got a wire that goes across at the top, so you can remove that however you want. You can either remove these retainers or just unclip the retainer. This one for me was broken, so that's why it came out like that. But basically you want to take this off of the timing cover so that we can actually remove the timing cover. Pull this up. I think it's got another clip over here. There we go. This comes up and out of your way. And at this point, there's a bunch of 10mm around this cover, and there's one over there. I'll start with that one and then work my way around. These ones back here are a little tricky just because they're hard to get to and hard to see. I definitely can't get this one with the air ratchet, so do it by hand. Okay, from underneath with the wheel off, you can see this last bolt that holds the top timing cover on. So let's remove that. There we go. Now we can pull off this cover. Might be a little tricky to get it out from the back there, but you have to just move this hose around until you find the right angle. Okay, it's almost out. stuck on this motor mount. There it is. There's your top timing cover. Set that aside. Now I want to remove this bracket here. So with a 12 millimeter, I'm going to break this bolt free. It's actually a nut. And remove it all the way. Looks like there's a washer behind it. Save that. Make sure you put it back where it belongs. Now with a 14 millimeter, I'm going to just loosen up this alternator bolt here. You don't need to remove it all the way. You just need to loosen it up enough to remove this bracket. It's actually slotted at the end, so it's kind of like a fork. It goes around the bolt. Okay, pull this off and set it aside out of your way. I'm going to pull this relay and fuse box out of the way. It's a little tab on the back side that if you just press, it unlocks. Set that to the side. And actually, before I put it in here, I'm just going to release this wiring harness from its retainer. That way I can pull it out of my way off of here. And then once this is out of the way, I'm going to release the wiring harness off of the alternator. There we go. And now we have a clear view of the adjuster down there that I need to loosen up. Okay, so you'll see a bolt on the side of this tensioner here. It's the adjuster actually. You don't have to take it all the way out, but you do have to loosen it up because that's what locks in the tensioner. So just bring it back a couple threads. You don't need to go far. And now with a 13 millimeter, I want to loosen this up. And as you'll notice, the whole alternator is going to drop down and release the tension off the belt. Now for me, this was recently removed, so it came off easy, but a lot of times the adjusters are actually frozen on there. Now you take off the belt, drop it down off the alternator, and now we can go underneath and continue working there. Let's finish removing the belt from underneath. Take this one off, set it aside. Now we have to take off the power steering belt, which is here, and let's unlock the power steering pump with a 12 millimeter socket. Okay, that one's pretty stuck on there for me, so I'm going to try a bigger tool. Yeah, there we go. Okay, loosen that up. You don't need to remove it. This is just a locking bolt for the tension. Now above the power steering pump, you can't see it, and it's really hard to get to also, but there's another 12 millimeter bolt kind of straight across. If you stick your hand up here, you'll feel it. To get to it, you're most likely going to need a very short extension with a shallow socket. That's basically the only thing that's going to get you there, because you're going to hit the frame on the side if it's too deep. And now I'm going to break this free. So I'm going to do one more turn. For me, this bolt is really stuck, but this is actually enough to loosen up the belt. As you can see, the power steering pump moves around, and it went from sitting right here on the tensioner to sitting over there. Now you can slip the belt right off. There you go. And remove it. At this point, I want to remove the harmonic balancer. This is a 22 millimeter bolt, and you need a pretty powerful impact to do this. There are other ways to get this off, which I'm not going to mention. You can research those, but basically, I'm going to try and take it off with a 22 millimeter socket. A little bit of a stronger tool. As you can see, not every air gun will do it. So as you can see, I tried two different pretty powerful air impact guns, and neither of the two will take this bolt out. A lot of times these are very tight on here. What I'm going to do now is use an oxygen acetylene torch, heat up the center of this bolt, and hopefully that will penetrate the bolt into the crank. Heat up the crank, and then as it cools down and expands, as it cools down and it contracts, it will be able to break free. And as it's cooling down, I'm going to work it back and forth with my air gun, and we'll see what happens. So let's fire up the torches. Okay, just going to go with a nice gentle flame. I'm just going to hold it here for as long as it takes to get this bolt nice and hot throughout the whole bolt. These are pretty long and very thick. Obviously, the head of the bolt is a 22, so Just hold it here so it can penetrate the heat all the way into the crank. Now that it's hot, let's try and go back and forth. I'm going to go loosen, tighten. Hopefully it breaks free. I guess I didn't even have to tighten. There it is. Now that this is out, let's put it back on. I want to bring the harmonic balancer with these bolts flat, parallel to the ground. I want to clean up the threads in here so I can get a puller in there so we can pull this out. Usually these are a press fit and they don't need a puller, but this one is, well, pretty stuck on there. So let's get that back in. Okay, just make it snug and then grab a breaker bar. With your breaker bar, you can turn the engine over until it gets to a point where you can work on these threads here, right there. Now remove the bolt again. Now I'm going to take some rust penetrant, just spray it inside of these holes here. That will allow me to use my tap and clean up the holes. And I know I'm using it on a locking plier, but my tap holding tool doesn't fit in here. It hits the frame. So these threads should be okay, but a lot of times they're still very dirty. So I'm just going to clean them up so that when I put my bolts in to pull the harmonic balancer out, I don't run into issues where the bolt actually strips out the hole and then, well, then you need to drill another hole or do something else to pull it, and it becomes even more of a nightmare. So I'll just take the 30 seconds that it takes to clean these holes, and then we'll put two 8x125 bolts in here. So I guess I should have mentioned that this is an 8x125 tap, and that one's good. So let's remove this, get two bolts and our puller, and we can pull this right off. And if you don't have a puller, you might be tempted to stick a couple pry bars back there and pry it off. Don't do that, because you will either crack the block depending on where you pry, or the timing cover. But either way, it's a bad idea. Don't do it. Rent a puller or get yourself one somehow, but do it the right way. So this is the kind of puller I have. It basically bolts onto this, like I said, and pulls it out. There are other kinds that grab on like a clamp basically to the sides and then pull it out. If you're reusing your harmonic balancer, I suggest you stay away from those, because a lot of times they'll break the sides. But if you have to use it, it's better than nothing, I guess. On this one, you put a rounded tip on, which actually helps center this inside of the crank pulley here. When you assemble it, you want to put it in such a way in which, as you thread the center part out, it's going to pull this out and therefore pull out the harmonic balancer. So as you can see, mine is threaded in or threaded out way too much. So I'll bring it in. I need this to be a lot closer to the harmonic balancer. A little more. Okay. Just going to go as close as I can to it. And then I'm going to take two bolts and drive them into right there. Grab two bolts, 8x125, that will fit. Make sure it's the right length. You want enough thread engagement on that harmonic balancer so it doesn't strip out the threads. Start that on right there. Now at least your tool's held in place. You can let go, start this one. It'll be kind of hard to see how to line it up or where the hole is, but now I'm going to bring these in so that I make sure that they have full thread engagement. Grab the socket because it makes it go faster. Okay, these are bottomed out. I'm going to back them out off just a little bit because they're actually bottomed out up against the timing cover. Okay, and now what you want to do is hold the center and unthread this portion. That's actually going to pull the harmonic balancer back. So for me, my tool requires a 27 millimeter here and a 16 on here. But of course for you it might be different. I'm going to hold the center. I have an adjustable wrench, not the greatest choice, but it's better than nothing. As I tighten this, it's actually pulling the harmonic balancer away. You could use an air tool on this, but I don't suggest it. I suggest just doing this by hand. Okay, it's starting to get pretty easy, so that's a good sign. That means it's almost off. Let's see if I can pull it off the rest of the way by hand. Oh, there it is. Here's the harmonic balancer. We'll take the tool off and set this aside. Let's take off 2 bolts that hold this timing cover on, then we can take it off. There's one right down here, 10 millimeter. Take that out. And one right up top here. There it is. Now this cover can slide right off. Now take this piece off, and then you put back your crank bolt, drive it in all the way. Now we need to time the engine and put it at top dead center so we can take the belt off. So with the bolt in, we can now turn the crankshaft clockwise, only clockwise, don't ever turn the engine backwards. And you want to turn it so that that little dimple there, which is on the back of this gear, so that dimple there needs to actually line up with that raised area on the engine. So we have to turn it until the two of them line up, and then we'll double check the camshafts up top. So go ahead and turn it clockwise. You're going to be fighting the compression because the spark plugs are in, but just keep going. And now I'm going to switch to a breaker bar, that way I have better control because it's very close, it's almost perfectly lined up, just not quite yet. And there it is right there. So now let's bring the vehicle down. As you can see, these are lined up. Let's go up top and check the top of the engine. So up top, on the top of the engine, you can see the camshafts, and you want to check that this little cutout here, it's like a little slot that Toyota cut in the camshaft gear, lines up with this indent on the timing cover. So if those two line up, you are at top dead center. If they don't, most likely this is going to actually be on the bottom and you're 180 degrees off on the top end of the engine. So you have to turn the crank around one more time, one full rotation of the crank, and then this will line up at the top. And both front and rear cams will be marked the same way. The back one's a little harder to see, but check for these marks on the back and the front. And as long as all 3 gears are aligned properly, so the crank and the 2 top cams are aligned properly, you're good, and let's take off the belt. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is remove this whole bracket here. It's held on by a few 12 millimeter fasteners. First one is this bolt on the top. Break it free. Then there's a nut straight down underneath it. Break that free as well. And another bolt right here on the corner, right underneath this stud that we already took the nut off of. Okay, now they're broken free. I'm going to grab my air ratchet to speed things up. Remove all 3 of those fasteners. There's one bolt. Take out this bottom one. Watch out so you don't jam your tool up against the frame. This one actually doesn't come out all the way. It'll stay with the bracket, and we'll have to take it out with it. Guess I'll have to do that one by hand. Okay, there's that one. Now we can pull this bracket off of the engine. I'm going to try and gently pry this off little by little. There we go. Be careful as to what you pry on. There it is. So This is the tricky part. You have to slide it as far out as you can, but it's actually still held on this stud at the bottom right there. So now you have to twist it in such a way in which it can come out. And here's that bolt that we removed, and the other bolt was up here. So I'm going to leave those in their corresponding holes. That way I know exactly where things go when it goes back on. Now back underneath, here's your tensioner. It's held on by two 12mm bolts, or should. I have a 13 here. Someone's put in a different bolt for me, but they should be two 12s. I'm going to break them free first. Okay, now do the other one. You want to make sure that you loosen these evenly. You don't want pressure on just one of these two ears because it can snap. These tensioners are under quite a bit of pressure, and you don't want to damage anything. And as you can see, now that I'm loosening the second one, the tensioner is starting to drop down a little bit and release tension off the belt. Now that it's broken free, I'm just going to switch to my air ratchet, make things go a little faster. Okay, go back and forth. There's one. The second one, and remove the tensioner. So now with the timing belt still in place, before we remove anything else, let's break free the camshaft bolts. They're 17mm, and they make a tool to hold the camshafts, but I don't have it. So if you don't have it, just keep the timing belt in and a breaker bar on the crankshaft to prevent it from spinning. It will spin a little bit and the timing belt will stretch, but this will hold it. All right, so right there my breaker bar at the bottom has bottomed out. And now let's break these free. They're pretty tight, so I'll get a long breaker bar. There's one. This one came free faster than I expected. Now for this one in the back, you'll have some hoses to get out of your way. Push the power steering hose out of your way, and a breaker bar is most likely going to hit this AC line. You can push it a little bit out of the way, but I have this long ratchet that will hopefully get me enough leverage to do the trick. There it goes. Okay, they're both loose. Make sure they're still bottomed out in there. You don't want these cams to pop off, but they're both freed up. And now that those are broken free, the engine did spin back just a little bit, about an inch on this timing belt. So I'm just gonna bring the engine forward back to where it's supposed to be, line up all the timing marks again. That should be perfect. Yep, right there. Check all your timing marks again, but they should all be lined up because we already lined it up once. Now we just brought it back to where it was. So now let's get the timing belt off. All right, now we can remove our belt. Take it off this tensioner pulley and remove it off of the crank. Follow it along and just remove it off the idler, off of the front cam gear, and off of the rear cam gear. There we go. There's your timing belt. Now with an Allen head, 10mm Allen head, let's remove this bolt here that holds on your tensioner pulley. I have a new one. It should come with your kit. There we go. When you take this off, be careful. There's a washer behind it. You want to save that washer and reuse it on the new tensioner. That's what spaces it off of the engine block, the exact amount that it needs to be spaced out. So it's a pretty important item. Okay, remove this, and here's the washer that I was talking about. Make sure you save that. Remove the tensioner pulley. Now this hole where the tensioner bolt threads in is actually hollow on the inside, and it goes inside of the engine. So because I'm replacing the water pump, which you should when you do this timing belt, I don't want coolant pouring into that hole and contaminating my engine oil. So I'm just going to put this bolt back in for now. That way the hole is plugged up and the threads will seal up from any coolant getting in there. So you don't have to bottom it out or anything, just put it in there so it stays and plugs up the hole. Let's take off this front cam gear, or sprocket, whatever you want to call it. Remove the bolt, and this should wiggle right off. And I'm going to put these on the top of the engine right here, exactly in the same area where they go. That way I don't accidentally put the front one in the back and the back one in the front. Although they are the same, but I just want to put them back exactly where they came from. Okay, let's remove this rear one as well. There it comes. Pull it out, and I'm going to put this on the engine on top right here so that I know that this is the back one and this is the front one. Now let's remove this idler pulley here. I have a new one, so I'm replacing it. Break it free with a 14mm socket. Okay, let's speed up the process a little bit. There it is. Save the bolt. Obviously you'll need it for the new one, but here's your idler pulley. Now let's take out the 6 10mm bolts that hold this backing plate on for the timing belt. So there's 2 around each cam gear and then 2 kind of right in the middle here. Last 2. Okay. Now, if you pull this off, it should come off. Might be a little bit stuck on there, but remove it. Perfect. So before I remove my water pump, as you can see, there's a lot of debris built up here, so I want to clean that off. I took a little vacuum cleaner and cleaned off the majority of it, but now I'm going to use some brake parts cleaner and just spray it all off. I don't want any of this getting inside of the engine. As soon as I remove the water pump, there's going to be a big gaping hole, and of course I don't want any debris getting in there, so just clean it off as much as you can. Obviously it doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as there's no debris that can make its way inside when you remove the water pump, that's what you're going for. Now, with a collection bucket underneath, let's take all the 10mm bolts off that secure this water pump onto the engine block. Just work your way around and remove them all. These down here are actually nuts, so keep that in mind. So that's everything that holds this water pump on. Now you want to grab it and slowly pry it away from the engine. Don't go too far because coolant's going to pour out, and I'm just going to give this a minute to stop draining. As soon as you break it free, it's just going to come pouring down. Of course, I have a collection bucket down here, and it's catching all the fluid. Let's give it a little bit more. No matter how much you drain the radiator, the engine is not going to drain. So as you can see, the studs are kind of in the way, and usually they have an inverted Torx on the end. These don't. So I don't know if someone has been in here before, because usually these water pumps will slide right off. They won't be easy to take off, but they do come off. But in my case, I'm just going to remove the studs. That way I can just take this water pump right off, and I kind of want it to remove the studs anyway to clean them. So clamp some locking pliers on them. There we go. That one broke free. Just grab some regular pliers. Now you can just work these out of here. Okay, there's one. Set that aside. Just remember which hole it goes into, because it can technically thread into several different ones, but remember it was the top right of the water pump. Okay, now you can take the water pump, and once you pull it far enough, you can twist it, pull it out, angle it, and it should come right off. Here's your old water pump. Set that aside. We'll remove the gasket. If you wanted to take out the other stud on the bottom here and clean it up, you can, which I might actually, just because it's corroded and rusted, but it's optional. If yours is good, you can leave it in there. Now with the water pump and gasket out of here, I took out the other stud, and this actually gives me a much better cleaning opportunity because I don't have to work around that stud, and I can also clean the threads on it like I wanted. At this point, be careful not to get a lot of debris in any of these 3 holes, and with a brand new razor blade, go around and scrape off all the corrosion or potentially gasket that has been left behind. You just want this area nice and clean so that the new gasket has a good bonding surface so it can seal up. Of course, you don't want any leaks here, because to fix the leaks, you have to undo everything that you would have just finished. So make sure that it's nice and clean. Of course, it doesn't have to look brand new as long as there's no junk still on this surface. You don't want corrosion or, like I said, old gasket. All right, so I cleaned it the best it could get. It's not perfect, of course, but a lot of this is just the aluminum is stained from corrosion. So it's not actually buildup on top of it. The surface is perfectly smooth. I ran my razor blade and my finger across to feel for any raised areas. There are none, so I'm just going to wipe down the surface. If any dust or debris made its way in here, just wipe it off. And after that, we'll degrease this surface here with some brake parts cleaner. But when you do that, you don't want to just spray the brake parts cleaner in there because it's going to get inside the engine. You want to spray it on your rag, and then you apply it here with your rag. That way it's a lot more controlled. But basically I'm degreasing this so that the new gasket doesn't have any sort of oils from the antifreeze getting in the way of it sealing properly. There we go. And sometimes I like to absorb some of the antifreeze that's stuck in that lower hole, just because if it's right on the edge of falling down or pouring out, it's going to pour out, and it's going to get in between your seal or the gasket and the block here. So just try to get some of it out. You won't be able to get all of it, but you'll get some of it. So I cleaned up the studs that go on the water pump housing here, or the engine block, I guess I should say. Thread them on, and then we will slide on the gasket, the water pump, and then put back the other stud. Because as you remember, the water pump doesn't really want to come out with both of them in there. So just snug this up. And they don't actually have to be very tight in here, because when you put the nut on the other side of the stud, the pressure of the nut will want to pull this stud out, and it will actually tighten up both ends of it. So just bottom it out and give it a snug, but you don't have to worry about tightening it very much. Okay, so I bottomed it out. Grab my locking pliers and lock them on there nice and tight. And then I'll just give it a nice snug. That should be perfect right there. As you can see, there are no more threads sticking out. It's bottomed out completely and snugged up. So now let's get the gasket in. Let's give this one last wipe down with some brake parts cleaner on the rag. Okay, and now let's get the new gasket on. This can only go on one way, so if for some reason it doesn't fit, it's because you have it backwards. You just have to figure out the angle that it needs to go at, and I think I just found it. Just like that. Perfect. Let's get the new water pump. Okay, let's get the stud in. I remember it went to the top right of the water pump, right here. Thread it on as far as it'll go by hand. Then we'll grab some locking pliers and tighten it down. Like I said, these are supposed to have some inverted torques on the ends of them, but from what it looks like, someone already tried to use it and broke them off, which is very common. That happens. I'm just going to do it this way. If you do it this way also, just make sure you don't damage the surface, and if you do, just sand down the burrs that you might have created with the pliers. Oh yeah, that one's not even spinning, so yeah, they're tight. Now let's get the water pump bolts in. All right, let's go around and put these in. Start them on by hand. We'll snug them and then torque them. The torque is 69 inch-pounds, not foot-pounds. keep that in mind. You'll snap them off right away if you do foot-pounds. And then there was one over here, and this is the last bolt. Now you will have these two, which are actually the two 12mm bolts that go through that engine mount bracket, but those go on later. And then you had these two nuts that went down here. And now let's get them all snugged up. I'm going to go in a cross pattern this time, that way it seats properly. Okay, let's grab the torque wrench. 69 inch-pounds. I'm also going to go in a cross pattern when I do this as well. 69 inch-pounds is not a lot, so if for some reason you don't have a torque wrench that goes this low, basically just snug them by hand with a ratchet, and that'll be 69 inch-pounds. Don't go too tight on these because they do strip out the threads internally inside the block easily. You're threading a steel bolt into aluminum, and the bolt is going to win in this case. Okay, one last nut here. Now I'm just going to go around and double check them all. Perfect. Now I'm replacing the cam seals. You don't have to, but I highly recommend it because to get to them, you have to just undo everything we undid. So you might as well do it now. To replace these, or to remove them, you can do it a few different ways. I'm going to take a screwdriver and gently stick it underneath, and usually you can pry them out like this. Try not to put too much pressure on the camshaft so you don't damage it, but if you just pry it out just like this, it should slowly pop out. Maybe go back and forth. There we go, it's coming out. And there it is. No damage. Perfect. Let's wipe up the area and install the new one. Give it a good cleaning. You don't want any debris getting stuck in there. And don't spray any brake parts cleaner in here because, well, it's going to go inside your engine. So just take the clean side of a rag. Just make sure there's no oil. Now grab your new seal, and you don't want to install it dry. You actually want to put some petroleum jelly. You can see behind it, there's a little spring there, and you want to pack that with petroleum jelly. And the reason you want to, well, two reasons here. Number one, the reason you want to pack it is because the petroleum jelly will hold it in there. It will prevent it from popping out as you try to install the seal. And the reason you want to use petroleum jelly and not just anything else is because it's petroleum based, and so is your engine oil. And so with heat, this will actually melt off. You don't want it to stay in here. This is just for installation that you need that. So with heat, this will melt off and mix in with your engine oil, and it's not going to cause any harm or damage. Now, of course, if you don't have petroleum jelly, silicone paste or something else is better than nothing. Try to avoid that at all costs, though. So now that this is on, I'm just going to slightly lubricate the outside of it with whatever I have left on my glove. And with the area still cleaned up, let's try to slide this on. When you slide it on, make sure that the inner part of the seal doesn't fold out like that as you put it on. So I'm going to go slightly at an angle. I have the inner part lubricated with the remaining petroleum jelly that was on my fingers, as well as the outside. And at this point, you should be able to evenly press it in. And you want to make sure that it's nice and flush with the outer part of the engine here. So just go around. As long as it's the right seal and you have it slightly lubricated, you should be able to put it in by hand. Try not to shove it in too much. It's not supposed to go in all the way. It's supposed to be nice and flush with the engine. So just like that, that's installed. Perfect. Now do the same thing to the rear. So I cleaned up this cover a little bit, front and back. Mine was a little bit oily, and you don't want oily, gunky residue on fresh new seals and a fresh new timing belt. So after it's cleaned, if you need to clean it, let's reinstall it, line it up to kind of where it was before. Make sure the wiring doesn't get pinched behind it. This should be right about here is where it's sat. So let's grab all 6 of these bolts, and I'm going to start them all by hand. Okay, last 2 back here. And this one's probably the hardest one to get to because you can't really see it. It's underneath the camshaft. And those are in. Let's snug them all up. These don't really have a torque. Just make them snug. Whoa. All right, it's all of them. So let's put the cam sprockets, cam gears back on. They have that little nub there that they line up with, so they can only go in one way. Now, for me, the person that did the timing belt last installed the rear cam gear backwards. And if you noticed at all, the timing belt was actually very slightly off. It was like literally coming off this way. So this front one has that plate or the little lip that is on the back side. However, the rear one, which is this one, it was mounted like this, but it's actually supposed to go on like this. And you'll see you have this timing mark here. And the reason that is because the lip will actually prevent the belt from coming this way on this one, and then this one has the lip on the back side and it'll prevent it from going that way. So that's why you want one in each direction, and it's important to keep it that way. So as you can see, there's still shredded belt on this pulley. Maybe I should clean that up. Let's grab the rear cam and put it on the right way this time. So with this lip facing out, okay, line it up and start the bolt in. And now we can't torque these down unless you have that special tool that holds them. We can't torque them down until the timing belt goes on. So we'll wait to do that. Okay, just hand tight for now is good. That way the cam gear doesn't come off. There we go. At this point, I will be replacing the front main seal or crankshaft seal, which is behind this sprocket here. So I'm going to remove this bolt, 22mm socket. Now be careful, the timing belt is not on the engine. So if you turn the crank backwards, it's going to move the pistons in or up and down. So if it does happen to move, we will have to correct it afterwards. Okay, it did not move at all for me. The timing marks are still lined up, so that's perfect. Before you remove this sprocket here, let's take off this timing belt retainer. 10mm bolt is just a little tab that sticks out there. And what it does is actually prevents the timing belt from skipping a tooth on the crank if for some reason it gets loose. Now let's remove this sprocket. Okay, so grab your puller and use 2 6x1 threaded bolts. Start them in to the threaded holes on this sprocket. And make sure that the center of this puller is lined up with the crank. Let's drive these in a little bit. And now tighten up the center, and slowly that should pull that sprocket away. I'll fix this washer, just like that. Now let's tighten this up. Yep. should come off the rest of the way by hand, so let's remove the puller. There it is. Now for this, I'm going to do the same thing that I did up top for the cam seals. Just going to take a screwdriver and try to pop it out. There it goes. Remove it. Make sure no debris makes its way in there. Clean up the area. All right, let's get the new seal in. Just like with the other two seals, I'm going to take some petroleum jelly and put it inside of this cutout here where the spring sits. There we go. And lubricate the outside with the remaining petroleum jelly. Now let's slide it onto the crankshaft. Make sure it goes on flat and even. There it goes. And push it flush with this outer lip. Feel around to make sure that it's evenly seated. Okay, that's perfect right there. Now put back this crank sprocket. I cleaned it up a little bit on the outside, degreased it. This should slide on with ease. If not, that means your crankshaft might be a little bit dirty, so go ahead and clean that off. But this should slide in and out just like that. Now let's put on this little retainer here, and you can wait to put this on. This is what holds your timing belt in place, but I find that it's actually helpful to have it on when you install the timing belt because it will hold it up against this sprocket here and it won't let it fall off. So let's go ahead and put it back where it was. Snug it up. It's perfect. Now let's remove this bolt for the tensioner. Make sure this area is nice and clean, and then we will reinstall the new tensioner pulley. I don't want to install the tensioner yet, just the pulley. That way the belt can ride on it. Once the belt is on, then I'll put this pulley in and put tension on the belt. Now let's get the tensioner pulley installed. Put the bolt through. And don't forget about the washer on the back side. By the way, I cleaned up the threads on this bolt. That way it has nice threads to hook onto, and again, washer. That's very important. Start this bolt in. Okay, let's bottom it out, and then we'll torque it. It's bottomed out. Let's grab the torque wrench. Torque this to 25 foot-pounds. Okay, it still moves. Perfect. Now let's leave it like this. Now let's put on this idler pulley. 14mm bolt. Get that started. Okay, let's snug it up. Okay, torque it to 32 foot-pounds. Right there. Now let's install the belt. As you can see, the timing belt is marked with arrows. FR stands for front. Front means the front of the engine, and the front of the engine is actually towards where I'm standing. So this goes backwards like this. And I'm going to start on the rear cam. This comes down to personal preference where you start. I like to start on the rear because that is the first area, or because this is the first pulley that is under tension, not tension, I don't know how to explain this. Hang on a second, let me, okay. So I like to start at the rear just because this is where the timing belt starts being under tension. So from here all the way around down to the crank. It's under tension. The area between this rear cam and the tensioner has slack until you apply tension, obviously. But so I'm going to hold it onto there and make sure that when you put it on, it's tight between here. So you don't want this to flop around. I mean, this is normal, but you don't want it to be all floppy. If it is, then you're off of the sprocket one tooth, so you need to fix it. So keep going around, make sure it's seated in all of these grooves. From here, you go around the water pump, and then let's make sure that this is still on here. It's kind of falling down. There we go, that's on. Press it down, or bring it down, and at this point, all we have left to put in, this is still under tension here, that's perfect. And the only thing left is the crank pulley, which I just slid it onto. So this has tension here, this has tension here, this has tension for the most part. This is as tensioned as it's going to get until you actually activate the tensioner. Basically what I'm looking for is if it flops around really bad, that means you're a tooth off. And this has tension here. So at this point, we can go underneath and finalize the tensioning of the belt by putting on the new tensioner. On the bottom, as you can see, the timing belt is on here, but it's actually not fully engaged here. So what I'm going to do is push it all the way around, making sure that the timing belt falls into the grooves here where it's supposed to. And at this point, if I push up on this, everything should be under tension, which it is. That's perfect. I can feel everywhere. So now let's grab the tensioner. Now I'm holding pressure on the tensioner. If I let go, the timing belt's going to skip a tooth on that rear cam just because the slack makes it go over one tooth. So I'm going to install this tensioner. This will hold the pulley kind of where it's supposed to go, but it'll at least hold enough tension to not make the timing belt skip. So I'm going to start both of these bolts in. I guess I should start the front one in first. That would be easier. Oh, there we go. This one's in. And let's start the front one. There we go. I'm going to grab my tool and snug them up. 12mm socket. There's one. Now I can let go. And the other one. Now let's torque these. 20 foot-pounds for both of these. There's one. And second one. Perfect. Now I want to check the belt one more time everywhere. It's tight here. This has slack like it's supposed to. Up top, yep, tight, tight, tight on the water pump. Okay, now we can pull the pin on the tensioner and you'll see this go up. There we go. That just tightened up the belt. Perfect. Let's get this crank bolt back in because now we have to actually turn the engine over by hand several times. Nice and snug. The reason you want to do that is because you want to ensure that the timing marks or the timing belt are properly lined up with all the sprockets and all their timing marks. So I'm actually going to turn it over 4, maybe 5 times by hand. It's not going to be easy because you're fighting the compression of the pistons. Spark plugs are in, so again, it won't be easy, but it's something that you should not skip. So let's go for it. I'll go one more turn and then we'll check it. Every time you do this, it's best to do it with a breaker bar, but if you do it with a ratchet, just try not to let it spin backwards. So now I'm going to line up my timing mark again with the top. And right there, that lines up. So now let's check the top pulleys and make sure those are lined up too. So back at the top, you can see the camshaft sprocket here, and that's the line that it has to, or the mark that it has to line up with. And it's not here, it's actually on the bottom. And that doesn't mean that you did something wrong. That just means that you're 180 degrees off on the timing for the top end of the engine. So what we need to do is go back down, spin the crank one full rotation, because one full rotation of the crank will be half of a rotation for this. And then we'll check again. So let's go for it. Almost there. Okay, that should be it right there. Yep, that lines up perfectly. I'm going to check the back as well. Back lines up perfectly as well. That means the timing belt was properly installed. If for some reason you were a tooth off, let's say on this one, let's say the gear was back one tooth, and then you go ahead and spin it several times, well, this mark will not line up with this again. I can't tell you how much it's going to be off, but it will be off, and you'll have the bottom line up, the back line up, and this will not line up. So you have to actually take the timing belt back off, fix it, retime it, and put it back on the right way. Now that the belt is on, I want to torque the cam gears, and I'm going to go to 65 foot-pounds for this rear one. The front gets torqued to 94. Don't ask me why it's different, but that's what the torque is. So I have my breaker bar with a 22 millimeter socket down on the crank holding it. I'm going to torque this rear one to 65. That's 65 right there. Let's move on to the front one. 94 for the front. Perfect. Next, I want to put back this bracket that holds the engine mount on. And remember, this bolt that went to the bottom right corner actually stays in the bracket because you don't have enough room to pull it out. So it needs this space to actually be already inserted. So slide that down. It won't be easy to line everything up, but once you get past the frame rail here, you can put it on the two studs that hold it on. I'm going to try and slide it onto this bottom one first, which is right there. That's on. And then push it down underneath this AC line. And it needs to slide on this one over here. There it goes. All right. Now push these in, or push the bracket in. Start on this bottom bolt. That's started. There's a nut that goes on that bottom stud over there. This top one we won't worry about yet. This is for the alternator bracket, which goes on later. Start that nut on. Start on this top bolt. It's easiest if you go underneath that AC line and thread it on. Perfect. Let's snug them all up. 12 millimeter, snug them all up. That's one. Go to that one next. Okay, and lastly, that nut that was down there, I can get easily from underneath, so let's snug that one up. Okay, nice and tight. Now let's take out the crank bolt again. Put back this piece. This is what actually holds and guides your timing belt down here. So the harmonic balancer will kind of sandwich this. Now we can get ready to put back the lower timing cover. Slide it over and line it up with the two bolts. I cleaned these up and put some anti-seize on them. They were pretty rusty, so that way they hopefully stay more protected in the future. There was one bolt here, and then there was another bolt up top, but that one doesn't go in yet. That one actually goes in when the upper timing cover goes on. So I'm gonna put those on for now and snug them up. Okay, there's one. Okay. Let's install the harmonic balancer. I cleaned up the inside a little bit. You can use some very fine sandpaper and wipe it clean if you need to. These are supposed to be a press fit, so that's exactly how it's supposed to fit by itself with no force. You definitely don't want to hammer on it, because if you need that much force to install it, either it's going on crooked or there's so much debris in here that it cannot fit and you're actually pushing the crank that way. So you don't want to use a hammer for sure. If you have to, clean it up so it can fit nice and smooth. Now, let's get the crank bolts back in. Okay, start it on by hand. Of course, you don't want to cross thread this. Now the torque for this is 159 foot-pounds. It's not very high, but it is pretty high up there, so I don't have a tool that's going to hold the engine for me while I torque it, so I'm just going to use my air gun and make it tight. If you wish to torque it, 159 foot-pounds is the torque. Okay, so that's bottomed out. That should be plenty tight. Now let's reinstall the timing cover on the top. And this one will be a little tricky to get down there just because it's hard to sneak it past this hose here and the rear cam and everything. So let's try to find the right angle without breaking it. There we go, I think I found it. And make sure no wires are getting pinched behind it, of course. And looks like we're clear. The only thing now is this top timing cover actually needs to slide underneath the bottom one. There's a specific bolt hole here that needs to go under. And I'm just trying to line it up. There we go. I think that just fell right into place. You'll know if it doesn't line up because it's not going to want to push all the way up against the engine. And what I did is I just pried the bottom cover out a little bit. Now let's get the bolts and put them in. I'm going to start here and work my way around. I cleaned these up as well and put some anti-seize on it. That way the bolts don't rust as much. And then that leaves us with this one down here. It's going to be probably the toughest one to get in there. Oh, I think I got it. Yep, got it. All right, let's snug them all up. Just going to start here, work my way around. It's tight. Okay, they're all tight. Now let's resecure this harness. It's got these clips on the back. They just need to slide into their corresponding little tabs here. And you can just press it, it'll lock down. This front one was broken for me, but I'm just gonna do my best to lock it down. That way it doesn't flop around everywhere. That's exactly what I want. Perfect. Let's get the engine mount bracket back in here. I'm just going to wire brush this area here a little bit. That way I remove some of the corrosion that has built up over time. And if you wanted to, I will. I'm going to put some anti-seize down on there. Just a very thin layer. You don't need a lot. As well as a little bit on here. Mainly just to prevent corrosion, really. Now let's put this bracket back on. Make sure it lines up down there. Press it on all the way. And to bolt it down, you put the other bracket on top with the two long bolts. They slide right down, just like that. I had this one that I put back on here, so I'm going to remove it. Slide this down, re-secure it. Actually, I think this... Don't forget to reattach this as well. Start them all by hand, and let's snug them up. I'll start with these two. This is a 12 millimeter, the other two are 14s. Perfect. Let's put this engine mount back, slide it into position, I had this longer bolt that went through here, and the shorter one at the back right here. I'm gonna snug this one up first. Tighten this one up as well. Just gonna double check with my ratchet. Nice and tight. Let's reconnect the two grounds. I'll put them underneath this mount, and one went to that wire over here, and the other one is back here. Make sure they click in and are secure. Now we can bring our overflow back to where it belongs, and it has this tab here with the rubber. Actually, the rubber is supposed to sit in there first, so put that back just like that. Now slide the overflow tank down and in. And secure it with the 10mm bolt. Nice and snug. Now there's another timing cover bolt that's supposed to go in here. I don't have one, and I think it's because the threads in there are all screwed up, so I'm not going to put one in. It's very secure without that one, but of course if you have one, put that in. Now let's get the power steering belt back in place. Put it around the harmonic balancer first, because it has to go behind this outer lip here. It's got two sets of ribs, so it's going to go right behind it. Then push it up and around the power steering pump. To tension this, it's a manual tensioner, so you have to pull the pump down. And the way I like to do this is actually with a long pry bar coming in through here. I'm going to stick my pry bar up and pry the pump down or away from the engine, just like that. And to set the tension, you want to grab the belt on the longest stretch of between pulleys, and it's even up and down for this one, so it doesn't matter where. And you want to turn it. If you can easily rotate it 90 degrees, then you know it's tensioned properly. If you can go past 90 like that with ease, it's too loose. And if you can't even go 45 degrees, it's way too tight. So for me, I need to go just a little bit more. Right about there feels perfect, and let's lock it in with that 12mm bolt. I'm going to get my ratchet ready on this bolt and stick my pry bar in and pry. I'm just going to double check the tension before I lock it in. Right there is good. Let's lock this in. I can also see that the bolt that I'm tightening right now lines up with the marks that it was at before. Make sure that's nice and snug. All right, and now there's one more bolt to lock in at the top of this power steering pump, and that will completely secure the tension, so it'll make sure it doesn't move anymore. Now I'm going to lock in this top bolt. This is the one that was really difficult to get to. Oh, there we go, I'm on it. Let's make sure it's nice and snug. There we go. Let's get the alternator belt on, and I'm not going to tighten it because I can't yet. I need to be up top for this, but I'm just going to set it in place here on the pulleys. Make sure that it's sitting in all the ribs where it needs to be as well on all the pulleys. So you got this one here, and then the AC over here, and then finally the alternator up top, which you can just barely reach from here. There we go. That made it on the alternator. Okay, so we'll leave it like this, then we'll go up top and snug it up. While we're here though, let's put back this cover. Remove the two bolts that I put back here. Set this back in place. There we go, put the two bolts back. Let's get the wheel back on. Start on all 5 of your lug nuts, snug them up, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. .76 foot-pounds. Let's snug up this bolt here, and that's what's going to tension up our alternator belt. You'll see the alternator go up as I tighten this up. Don't go too far. We'll check the tension after a couple seconds of tightening it. Okay, right there. I want to check the tension on the belt, and again, just like the power steering belt, you want to grab the longest stretch of belt with no pulleys. In this case, that's this part on top. And I want to spin it 90 degrees. If it's easily spinning 90 degrees, then that's perfect. I should mention you want to grab it in the middle, not next to a pulley. So if it spins between 45 and 90 degrees easily, then you're good. This one is actually a little too tight for my liking, so I'm going to back it off. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, that's much better. Right there, I can easily spin it about 80 degrees, so that's perfect. Anywhere between 45 and 90 is what you want. So at this point, let's lock in the tension with this other 12 millimeter bolt right down there. Okay, it's getting snug. That's nice and tight. Before we tighten up this top bolt for the alternator, I have to put back this bracket that goes right in here. There we go, between the washer and the alternator, and set it in its spot down there. Start on the nut. Let's snug up the nut. Nice and tight. And let's snug up this bolt with a 14 millimeter socket. Oops, I'm loosening. Make sure this is nice and snug. Now I'm going to put back this box, relay box that I disconnected. There we go. And this wiring harness clipped in over here on the alternator. And this one was secured in here. All right, let's fill it with coolant. Now let's fill the cooling system. Remove your radiator cap. Set that aside. I have a spill-proof funnel here. It helps a lot when filling and bleeding the system. But if you don't, just make sure you don't make too much of a mess. Tighten this down. Let's fill it with coolant. If you're not sure what to use, you can refer to your owner's manual. I'm using Universal coolant, but like I said, details are to be found in your owner's manual. Let's fill it up until it stops bubbling by itself. At that point, we'll turn on the engine and go from there. Okay, it looks like it stopped bubbling by itself. I'm massaging this upper hose just a little bit to hopefully squeeze out some remaining air. But now I actually want to bring the coolant level in the funnel up to about a quarter of the way up the funnel. That way this is the highest point in the cooling system, and naturally the air is going to want to rise and come out as I run the vehicle. Let's add a little bit to bring it up to about a quarter of the way up the funnel, like I said. Right there's perfect. Now let's start the engine. I want to set the temperature all the way to hot inside. The blower on low or medium, you don't have to max it out. I'm going to keep it on low, and you want the air to blow at the vents. That way you can actually feel the hot air coming through. You want to wait until hot air comes through the vents, and I can feel air, so that's good. Once it starts getting hot, you know the coolant is circulating, warming up, and you also want to pay attention to your temperature gauge right there. Right now it's cold because obviously we just started it, but as long as it stops somewhere halfway through, you know you're good. If it starts going all the way up to the hot, you're overheating. You need to stop the vehicle and wait for it to either bubble up the air that's in the system, or you have a different issue. But if you didn't have an overheating issue before, it should still be fine. So we'll wait for that to warm up fully. Another way to know when it's fully hot or at operating temperature is the cooling fans will start blowing and cooling down the engine. So let's wait for that to happen. So the car ran, it fully warmed up, I had heat inside. The cooling fans did not come on, but both the lower and the top radiator hose were hot, which means the coolant has circulated, the thermostat has opened. So now let's get this funnel off of here. A little trick is if you squeeze this top hose, a couple air bubbles. Anyway, if you squeeze this top hose a little bit, put your plug in on the funnel and then lift as you release the hose, it'll drip less. Now I'm gonna put the rest of it in my overflow, and on the side of it, you can see there's this line right here. That's where it has to go up to. That's the full mark. Okay, there we go, right there. Oh, got a little more. There we go. All right, coolant's in here. Let's cap this off, and let's reinstall our radiator cap. There we go. Put the radiator cap back. Close the hood and take it for a road test.